Great. Welcome everyone to this session of the Global Political Thought Seminar Series. My name is Ning. I'm a PhD student in political theory at the Department of Government at Harvard, and one of the co-organizers of the Global Political Thought Project, also housed at Harvard and some other partner institutions. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Jessie McCarthy today as our speaker for this seminar session, and Huey Hewitt as our discussant for the session. Before introducing our speaker and discussant, I'd like to say just a couple of quick things about the Global Political Thought Project. One of the motivations behind setting up the Political Thought Project the Global Political Thought Project was to engage in ongoing work to re-theorize the political theory discipline and to expand its boundaries beyond a historically very restricted set of conceptions and assumptions about where the borders of the field lie. With this in mind, our seminar series this semester in particular not only actively tries to globalize the seminar series by reaching out to speakers from the Global South in particular, as well as in institutions more broadly beyond the Euro-American West. It also seeks to engage speakers and presenters who formally or otherwise work beyond the discipline of political theory and political thought narrowly conceived. This is one of the reasons why I'm particularly delighted to welcome Professor McCarthy as our speaker and interlocutor today. Professor Jessie McCarthy is an assistant professor jointly appointed in the Department of English and the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. His research is concerned with the intersection between politics and aesthetics in African American literature, post-war or post-45 literary history, and Black studies. His new collection of essays, Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul, explores connections between art, literature, and politics in his own life and Western culture more broadly, while also working to reinvigorate the essay form as a space not only for argument, but for experimental writing that mixes and chops the old ways into new ones. He's an editor at The Point and has written for N+1, Dissent, The Nation, and The New Republic. Huey Hewitt is a doctoral student in African American Studies with a primary field in history and a secondary field in studies of women, gender, and sexuality. A Harvard Presidential Scholar and Prize Fellow, he's interested in the Black radical tradition, the relationships between theory and practice in Black freedom movements, histories of Black transgender and gender non-conforming life, and the carceral state. Huey also engages in community organizing and speaking engagements outside of his academic life. He prioritizes working alongside currently and formerly incarcerated Black transgender people as an organizer and uplifting the theories and knowledge produced by all imprisoned intellectuals. Huey holds a BA in History and Black Studies from Amherst College, where he graduated summa cum laude in 2019. Thank you so much, Professor McCarthy and Huey, for the presentation today. And Professor McCarthy, over to you.
Well, thank you, Ning, for inviting me and prompting me to write this paper and share it with all of you. And thank you, Huey, for agreeing to be discussing and to respond. I suppose you will have read the paper, but I'll say quickly that. Obviously I come to this in some sense as an outsider. I'm not primarily a political theorist, although I like to think that all the work that I do, which is, foundationally grounded in primarily literary study, and within that with a kind of specialization in African-American literature, but also Black thought and intellectual history. That kind of angle, in a sense, to me, is always bringing the question of the political back in. And I think partly I've been interested in trying to think a little bit about as we moved into a moment of what appears to be a kind of, or is arguably a kind of prolonged moment of crisis. In some sense, for liberalism as such, and liberalism not only in the United States but globally, per the sort of mandate of this particular forum. I've been interested in thinking a little bit about a kind of the task of taking stock, of looking back, making a kind of critical inventory over what, rightly or wrongly, I think it might not be entirely unfair to think of as a kind of historical block that seems to be kind of coming into view as this period in between roughly 1979, 1980, and the ascent of neoliberalism to power, Reagan and Thatcher. It's a familiar story. I know everyone will be familiar with. And 2020 it's a nice convenient 40-year block. And I've been thinking a lot about, on the one hand, how we ought to think about the kind of the intellectual horizons and the political horizons, in a sense, in terms of discourse, what they have been over those 40 years, and sort of what they've come out onto now, where we stand today. And in a sense, I do think that it's sort of uncontroversial to say that in some sense, identity has slowly but surely made its way to the center of that discourse, in a variety of different ways, and obviously for many different purposes. And in one sense, I think there's an emerging view that we can see of, on the one hand, an identity politics that is largely identified with the political and cultural left, that takes its kind of early cues from the post-structuralist moment, but has also informed a kind of a sphere that extends far beyond sort of the academic one, and has entered into a kind of common way of thinking and a common parlance. And in particularly, though it's of course always been there, but with a kind of resurgent intensity, and I would argue even virulence, a right-wing identity politics that is also mounting an increasingly explicit and hostile contestation of liberalism, so an identity politics coming from the right. And I find myself, in a sense, in the uncomfortable position of thinking, on the one hand, about someone who's always felt, particularly coming out of the traditions that I primarily engage with intellectually, at a bare minimum, I would say, a fairly severe skepticism about liberalism. But on the other hand, noticing that I would say there seems to be a kind of unproductive and often, in various ways, retrograde way in which identity politics seems to not be allowing us to move in directions that seem salutary, and that share commonalities on both. Well, I wouldn't say they share commonalities, but they might lead to dead ends on both the left and the right. But the question would be, in that case, what else is there, and what alternatives are there? And I'm not going to press that strongly for the notion that the word alterity itself, or a concept of an alterity politics, is actually a solution to this. So I would say, at most, a kind of tentative proposal that I put out there as a kind of way to stimulate debate and thought around what kinds of other formulations or articulations we can think of at this particular juncture. But underneath it, I suppose one of the things that I am interested in prompting or provoking is trying to think carefully about the extent to which part of the grounds for the flourishing of identity politics discourse has a relationship to a kind of sundering away from what the, you know, in the Marxists in an earlier day referred to generally as the social question. And in some sense, one of my concerns has been that even in the best articulations that I consider sort of close to a kind of line of thought that appeals to me, and this would be, for example, the Appiah's, the ethics of identity. What I'm concerned is still missing there is a kind of for all of its impressive and I think very compelling vision. What I still find lacking is a sufficient attention to the social question, to the problems of thinking about a just political economy and its relationship to the quote unquote values that we ideally might want to guide our politics and undergird a political system. So that, I think, is sort of what I would say sort of roughly the kinds of orientations that I was interested in kind of pulling together. I don't know, this is in a sense, I think, a kind of very much a sketch of the paper. It's not really a paper that that I've extensively invested in and thought through, but I'm happy to contribute it to this forum, and I hope that maybe it's at least stimulating and interesting to folks, and if it provokes further conversation and debate, all to the good. But that's sort of generally, I think, what how I interpreted certainly the opportunity that was generously and kindly offered me to contribute to this forum.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, Professor McCarthy. Huey, you're over to you for the response.
Yes, so thank you, Ning, and thank you so much, Professor McCarthy, for those important and searching reflections on some of the most important issues of our day. I want to structure my remarks such that the first part of my response engages Professor McCarthy's ideas and arguments on the terms in which he presented them in the paper. And then I'd like to bring in some of the shadow genealogies that I perceived while reading and listening to this paper, or listening to the summary. So at stake here, to my mind, is the possibility of something like a resuscitated universalism, the meaning or meanings of identity politics, and as gestured toward at the end of the paper, the matter of Black socialist futures, or in light of contemporary apocalyptic conditions, from the pandemic to climate change to war between nuclearized states, the matter of any kind of future at all, and the price of the ticket of working toward that future. So identity politics and/or alterity politics, and I will tease out the meaning of that and/or in a moment, are for Professor McCarthy the potential terms of post-liberal politics in the wake of neoliberalism and in the face of what some might refer to as neo or just plain unprefixed fascism. In the thumbnail sketch of history Professor McCarthy provided in his paper, the collapse of the Soviet Union was central to the successful establishment of Anglo-American liberalism as an unrivaled, if not uncontested, ideal. Of course, we may see the seed of neoliberal hegemony in the responses by state and corporate powers to the world's decolonization movements of the mid-20th century, as well as the concomitant rise of the so-called New Left within the United States. And in the face of this neoliberal hegemony, Professor McCarthy remarks that, quote, The response by at least one section of the intelligentsia has been the deconstruction or reconstruction of the subject under the sign of identity as a marker of resistance or at least resentment, end quote. Reading these developments not only as concurrent, but also conjunctional becomes a means of analyzing the left's discursive retreat from liberal universalism and embrace of seeking redress from the state based on claims of identity, rather than for the purposes of redistributing wealth, what Professor McCarthy just referred to as the social question or the labor question in his paper. From here, Professor McCarthy does not completely outright dismiss the utility of identity as a frame or as a tool, but instead unveils the false universalism of the contemporary right, mired in what is referred to as white identity politics, and argues for a fuller, truer, better universalism, one that can acknowledge both the spiritual wealth and violence of our collective inheritance, while envisioning sustainable futures based on something like alterity. Alterity here becomes a means of salvaging the best of a Western liberal heritage, while also acknowledging and maybe even battling its underbelly, its contradictions, in the forms of slavery, borders, and militarism. Professor McCarthy derives this idea of alterity from the specificities of the Afro-American experience. Importantly, he names the contradictions of this experience in his paper as not only conceptual, but also material, which for academic intellectuals take the forms of benefiting from imperial wealth through salaries from elite institutions, citizenship, and more. Amidst the turmoil of the contradictory question of identity for Afro-Americans, Professor McCarthy gestures toward the possibility of a transformational politics. This is perhaps the most important part of his paper. After quoting Frederick Douglass's support for a liberal immigration policy, Professor McCarthy notes that, quote, Black people have worked to transform the United States into a home while they were being oppressed, and yet still hold the door open deliberately for others, because it promises a more just picture of the future, end quote. An example of what Professor McCarthy would describe as not an identity politics, but an alterity politics. What it means to be the bearers of a legacy for others. This becomes the foundation of a newer, truer universalism. So before I get into some of the shadow genealogies of identity politics and transformational politics that I want us all to collectively consider, genealogies which I think will serve to really extend this conversation rather than to critique it, I do have to name my one real critique of the paper, and that is the question of home and inheritance. Central to Professor McCarthy's understanding of Afro-American alterity is the history and ongoing legacy of enslavement. But what about that other collective trauma that so profoundly marks our past and present here in the Americas? Land dispossession. What does it mean to claim a home or to make claims for Black freedom upon native land? What does it mean to open the doors for seemingly inclusive waves of migration in the context of continual assaults on the sovereignties of indigenous nations? While I agree with Professor McCarthy's insistence on the need for some kind of transformational politics, many kinds of transformation are foreclosed by occupying a home built on these foundations. And in the context of identity and its utility, what Native writer Vine Deloria Jr. once called peoplehood seems to be worth revisiting as a serious challenge to universalism, or at least any kind of universalism that might efface cultural integrity or indigenous relationships to land. As to what a transformational politics might mean with and against identity, I think it's absolutely crucial that we turn to the work of the Black feminists who wrote the Combahee River Collective Statement, where the term identity politics first appeared in writing, as well as the work of Kathy Cohen. In turning to the Combahee Statement, my aim is to re-genealogize identity politics so as to more firmly disentangle it from its misappropriation under what some scholars have called neoliberal multiculturalism. And in turning to the work of Kathy Cohen, I hope to re-articulate in concrete terms the stakes and possibilities of transformational politics and coalition building. So the Combahee River Collective Statement, written in 1977 by a group of Black feminist lesbians committed to analyzing and battling interlocking systems of oppression, was a response to the repeated degradation and devaluation of Black queer women in broader society, as well as, unfortunately, in social movement formations. This statement reads in part, quote, "Our politics evolve from a healthy love for ourselves, our sisters, and our community, which allows us to continue our struggle and work. This focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity. We realize that the liberation of all oppressed peoples necessitates the destruction of the political economic systems of capitalism and imperialism, as well as patriarchy. We are socialists because we believe that work must be organized for the collective benefit of those who do the work and create the products, and not for the profit of the bosses. Material resources must be equally distributed among those who create these resources. We are not convinced, however, that a socialist revolution that is not also a feminist and anti-racist revolution will guarantee our liberation. We have arrived at the necessity for developing an understanding of class relationships that takes into account the specific class position of Black women who are generally marginal in the labor force," end quote. So just as in the draft circulated of Professor McCarthy's paper, just as he identifies in that paper with William Gardner, the person who was enslaved by James Madison, I find myself identifying with these Black lesbian feminists because for my first 19 years of life, like them, I navigated the world being seen as, and thus also degraded and devalued as, a Black queer woman. And at the level of affect, I therefore feel protective of their notion of identity politics. I feel that the legacy of the term must be protected and cherished and separated from its misuses and abuses by those who, unlike the Combahee River Collective feminists, are invested in the maintenance of state and corporate power. There is a sense, I would argue, and I think Professor McCarthy might agree, that identity politics in its original form was always already an alterity politics. The last remarks I make concern the subject of transformational politics. Here, the work of Cathy Cohen is a central contribution to this discussion. As she argued in her 1997 essay, Punks, Bulldaggers, and Welfare Queens, The Radical Potential of Queer Politics, with a question at the end of that title, and re-articulated in her 2019 Redux, The Radical Potential of Queer, 20 years later, queerness has the potential to denote not, quote, a personal politicized identity, but instead a collective position relative to state and capitalist power, end quote. For her, radical queer politics has the ability to create a space in opposition to dominant norms, a space where transformational political work can begin. Within this vision, she writes, quote, individuals like Michael Brown and Rekia Boyd are important queer subjects, not because of their sexual practice, identity, or performance, but because they, as well as other young and poor folks of color, operate in the world as queer subjects, the targets of racial normalizing projects intent on pathologizing them across the dimensions of race, class, gender, and sexuality, simultaneously making them into deviants while normalizing their degradation and marginalization until it becomes what we expect, the norm, until it becomes something that we no longer pay attention to, end quote. Cohen notes of the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement that it is easier to see the queers in the movement than the queer politics of the movement. This is where I see a lot of resonance with Professor McCarthy's reflections. For him, alterity is an unconditional and ethical responsiveness to the other, a willingness to engage the other, to change and be changed by the other, and to therefore find in the chaotic space of difference the very foundations of a potential shift in political economic institutions, which for Professor McCarthy might take the form of a resuscitated universalism. My main question is what we do once we are on the side of alterity, on the side of queer politics, with the remaining chaos and thus potential violence of difference. The main form of difference with which Professor McCarthy deals in his paper is that of race, with the question of class appearing more so as ideological rather than a matter of identity. But identity reappears to disrupt our embrace of a politics of alterity in moments of intracommunal war, Moments that seem so hopeless, so as to make transformational queer politics seem impossible. Let me be concrete here through naming. Danielle Johnson, Angel Nera, Tiani Alexander, Dominique Jackson. Women who were murdered. Black transgender women who were murdered by Black cisgender men. For Cohen, as well as for myself, and I think for Professor McCarthy as well, the transformational politics to which we all turn cannot deny that the men who murdered these women have the capacity to be a part of a politics of alterity, are marked as queer by the state, have identities that, when placed alongside the women they murdered, represent both affinity and difference. And yet, I think the very fact of these women's lives being taken, their destinies being violated by transphobic violence, presents a problem for politics of alterity. A problem that brings us back to the question of identity as a real question, part of the broader inquiry that forces us to ask, how do we walk together on separate paths? March together when so far apart, join hands when some of us risk our limbs being cut off. And so, Professor McCarthy, I leave you with the question of how to wrestle with the chaotic and potentially violent forces of difference as identity amidst shared alterity toward newer, truer universalist futures. And I leave you with that question, knowing that it's very unfair and that I myself don't have an answer to it, while still prizing any reflections that you might have to offer. Thank you.
Thank you, Huey. This is a really fantastic response, and it's an important response on a number of levels. Not least of which I think is an important point that you raised early on, and maybe I'll just address this one first and then try and work forward, which is the question of how we think about and how we understand the genealogy of a concept or a notion of identity politics. And you rightly point out that actually the locus for this would be the Combahee River Collective, the statement from '77, but also, and importantly, all of the organizing and political work that has come directly out of that work of intellectual formation. And it has to be said that it is surely not an accident, nor is it coincidental, that this genealogy is with extraordinary consistency hidden away from contemporary conversations about identity politics. Let's just say in contemporary, in the media and large and loud venues where these things get yelled about a lot on television and so on and so forth. And we need to think about here a kind of problem that haunts us, which is not one that has to do, I think, with the correctness of analysis, or I would say even the justice and rightness of the values that the queer Black women and others who contributed to and formed the kind of outflows of that tradition, that genealogy of identity politics. The question of a kind of a tactical and strategic problem, which has to do with the fact that those ideas and those values have, in fact, as you say, Huey, been hijacked quite easily, I might add. And this is a bit of a problem we need to think about as well, by those, often in bad faith, obviously, but also in a sense because one of the I would argue one of the important kind of contexts for contemporary politics is, you know, a Habermasian public sphere that's fairly degraded in terms of its deliberative capacity, right? So in fact, most people don't know this genealogy. Most people don't read. Most people are, in particular in the United States, we have a very anti-intellectual culture to begin with. Most people are not interested in taking the time to actually unpack and understand the origin of the ideas and what is actually said, as opposed to what is sort of thoughtlessly regurgitated. So for example, I'm willing to bet that even on a campus like Harvard's, you'll find many people claiming that identity politics is about a so-called proverbial oppression Olympics. Even though no such formulation ever appears in the Combahee River Collective Statement, and in fact, just the opposite is articulated there. And so that hijacking into, if we want to call it a kind of neoliberal multiculturalism, which then acts as the straw man, a kind of bad straw man that others use to often in a sort of disguised fashion promote their own identity politics, even as they claim those politics to be universalist. I guess what I would want to say is that we have to confront both the question of, I think a theory of politics, for me, which ought to be pragmatic and not merely theoretical, has to think not only about getting the analysis right and the values right, but concretely about strategy and tactics, which I think actually matter to politics. In other words, I'm somebody who's interested in a politics that's actually capable of making a difference and not just quote unquote being on the right side of history, but as we slide into an authoritarian capitalist fascism. And that means having the capacity to convince and expand and create movements with broad constituencies, and in fact to pull in even occasionally people who otherwise one might think of as one's adversaries. And so I think that I think that's an important, I would say, question that in fact your response makes clear to us. You allude in a sense to the, the point, as you say, the visibility of queer folks or queer leaders within certain movements, as opposed to the queer politics of those movements, right? But we know that that's itself, in part a kind of problem of, and this gets to the kind of the Jean-Luc Nancy in the background of my paper, right? Of what happens when you're confronted with a social ground and a public sphere and a general kind of societal situation in which getting a message across, getting people together in order to think about a problem, in order to deliberate for themselves and amongst themselves, is itself a serious problem, a serious challenge. So that's something I think to think about. I don't have answers for it, but I think it's a problem we're confronted with in fairly self-evident ways. You ask and this I think is a really important question about how can we walk together in difference but on a common path. And in a sense, I take that to be I think both on the one hand a kind of restatement of what probably you correctly sense as my gesturing towards wanting to create a kind of better, new and improved universalism 2.0, while at the same time I hear you cautioning and chastising an overeager desire to do so that's unable or unwilling to confront the very specific and concrete violence that is in repeated and quite horrific fashion undermining those possibilities on a daily basis. And here we get to a really difficult question that I certainly don't have an answer for. I welcome others to think together with us about it. But I suppose partly what I might say about that is, I think that if we don't want to call it alterity, we might call it something else. If we want to stick with identity and we want to just double down on and say, the future is identity politics, just an identity politics that somehow undoes itself from its co-optation by neoliberalism. All of that is good and well for me. Where I think I might go with this, and this is by way of trying to incorporate what I think might be, in fact, one of your most difficult questions. They've all been incredibly challenging, and I appreciate them. Which is, of course, your question about indigeneity, indigenous rights, land dispossession, and sovereignty. Of course, I myself find that on this question, I don't know. I don't know that. I mean, I don't have a thought through and affirmative position to articulate. I will say that it seems to me complicated. A complicated question it seems to me either you want to get rid of the idea of sovereignty completely and thoroughly, and commit to a kind of some version of anarchism in a very deep and substantive way, or it seems to me you're only throwing the question back to speak of various kinds of indigenous sovereignties. Which it seems to me are not any more or less questionable than other forms of declarations of sovereignties, which are equally sort of legal fictions that organize themselves around monopolies of violence and are in truth, in the deep, again, Nancy sense of common existence, they're all contingent. The various positions that human beings show up on the earth, none of which any of us have had any control over. No one decided where they were going to be born, or in what body, or on what continent, or in what country. But the dispersal of human beings over the face of the planet Earth, it seems to me, is equally contingent all the way down. So I'll just that seems to me worth pointing out. I guess my contra to that, and this is not in a sense to argue with you, although I love arguing with you. We've done it before, and I hope we'll do much more of it going forward. But I guess one thing I might say is, I think in the back of my mind, and this has a little bit to do with the, I admit, totally kind of canned history that I offer about, the end of the Cold War and so on and so forth. But it also has to do in a way with my critique of Appia, which is we could, in an abstract sense, fall back on various kinds of frustrations with sovereignty. We could, I suppose, yearn for a kind of purely stateless and anarchic, perhaps anarcho-syndicalist, communalist world peoplehood, and maybe eventually we'll get there. and maybe that would be, and maybe that's something to yearn for. My provisional point would be that it strikes me that in between now, where we stand right now, concretely in 2022, and there, a universal, let me take that bad word away, a peoplehood in freedom, without borders, without states, without capital, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's going to be as you say, a path to walk, right? There's going to be some time. Things are going to have to happen. Another way of saying that is that there's going to have to be history, and indeed there has been history. And so one of the things that that grounds kind of my critique of liberalism is that a lot of liberalism, including Appiah's, tends to love to talk about the ideas without and history falls out. And part of course, what falls out with the falling out of history is the social question. And part of what I'm pointing to in Douglas, for example, is and others, is the fact that in fact we hope, at least I think, to have choices about the future. We hope that we can that we're free in some sense with respect to our future, but we're not free with respect to our past. Certain things have happened. There is, in fact, a particular history to the nation state that we live in right now, the United States of America. It is in many ways an appalling history. It perhaps is mostly an appalling history, but it's not, to me, it's not optional. In other words, it's not, and politics ought not to imagine that it can move forward in a kind of tabula rasa, just by having come to, through intellection, the right values, and then we proceed forward. In fact, projects have taken place, and the United States, among other things, has been a fiercely contested project. The history of that contested project, it seems to me, has to have a bearing on how you articulate your politics. And in some sense, this is partly where I feel like I'm always coming back to, which is it's not so much that I yearn for a rehabilitated and certainly unburdened universalism that is just great, just sign up for this charter and we're all good to go. But actually that while I adhere to and admire many of and think liberals have important questions and conversations about how we ought to think about the relationship between power, the state, and the individual, and various other questions. It is dangerous and I think deeply deceptive and unfortunate when that is divorced from questions about the concrete history that has actually taken place, right? And so when you are in the ivory tower and deciding that you think liberalism has had its day and you want to conceive of a project of rethinking the US Constitution and constitutionality, and you want to and you've decided what the good is, it's going to be interesting to me if that conception, I would say symptomatically and not coincidentally, seems to have an extraordinarily detached ahistoricity. And I think it's precisely the confrontation with the specific historicity of places and peoples that has to inform the ethical content of Alterity. And hopefully the meeting or juncture of those things, it seems to me, would inform something like an Alterity politics that hopefully would maybe eventually, though I suspect it will be a long path given the state of things today, would hopefully put us at least in the direction of maybe ultimately being able to overcome even the frameworks of its original founding, right, and move towards something like a genuine peoplehood, and a genuine withering away of the structures of domination and power. But before they can be withered away, it seems to me they have to be brought into control, which is to say, they have to be made able to be influenced by the people and the needs of the people. And that, of course, is a project that, it seems to me, in many ways, much of the contemporary apparatus is designed specifically to prevent, right? And that's the question for me. The question of politics, including, and very importantly, the social question, is about how you reverse that balance of power. And it seems to me that a concrete politics has to think about the tactics and strategies and theories for achieving that moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that exchange. I'm going to stop the recording right here so that we can open the floor up to discussion.